Thanks for joining us on this Care to Explain episode. We are joined by Tyler Shipper, who is an associate professor in economics and data analytics at the University of St. Thomas. Tyler, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
We are talking tariffs. We had this tariff talk before, but that was before the tariffs were in place. And now we're a few months in, and it has been nothing but a roller coaster. But what we're trying to do is understand how it affects every single person, every single business in various ways. There's a lot going on here with strategy. There's a lot of things that are being done that seem unprecedented. Mm-hmm. And I'm just happy to have an economics expert here to help us break it down so we can all understand what's happening, what has happened, and what might happen in the future here.
And I'm certainly excited to learn new stuff. I know that you've done a lot of work to talk to small businesses and what this is looking like on the ground. And maybe I get the perspective at 30,000 feet, and it's always good to hear those anecdotes from people that are experiencing it in very real ways.
All right. So what seems historic to you about what the tariff landscape is right now?
I think two elements I would say are historic. One is the degree to which tariffs have changed. That even if we're at the point where a lot of the more aggressive tariffs, the Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs, are postponed, it looks like the baseline is going to be 10% across the board at the very least. Mm-hmm. And that's a dramatic increase in what tariffs have been for roughly the last 100 years. So I think that part is historic. The other part that seems historic is the amount of uncertainty around this policy. That typically administrations are not wanting to change policy this quickly because it creates so much uncertainty. Why would you want to hire new people or make an investment or start a new branch or a new product line when you don't know what the policy is going to be next week? In prepping for this, I was trying to figure out what a specific tariff rate was on a specific country that had been changing. And, the number of breaking news exclusive reports you can find for a specific country that have come out in the last 2 weeks make it really difficult for a trained economist to figure out what the tariff rate is, much less a small business that's not thinking about what the tariff rate is specifically because they're worried about relationships and customers.
Right. So here's what we found. We wanted to track 4 different businesses, Minnesota businesses, to see how tariffs are affecting them, right? You tell a small story and it helps all of us understand what's going on. And in this case, we started, we started at a rug company in Wayzata. They're called Curio Rugs. And all they do is import pre-owned, vintage, hand-sewn wool rugs from the Persia area, right? From Afghanistan and Turkey and India. And these are like thousands of year old practiced, like handmade, beautiful, sort of called Persian rugs, right? But everything that she sells is imported. And so she bought the rugs for the same price from her merchants overseas. But when they got to the port in Chicago, she had to pay $1,700 just to get it released to her. Mm-hmm. She's like, thankfully we had that money because she's a small business. Yeah. But they don't know what they're going to do. Like instantly, this just shows how tariffs raise the price for the importer, and then it typically is moved on to the consumer, in which she is saying, if I have to pay another batch of tariffs, I'm going to have to raise the prices. And if the tariffs go up to 30%, she said, I may no longer be in business because my product is already a luxury product.
Yeah, so a couple things to unpack there, right? This is the difference between who pays the tariff, right? Right now, it's the U.S. importer, the U.S. company that's paying that tariff. It's often unknown until it gets to the port, so that creates uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And going forward, it's the consumers that will often have to pay this. And so who ends up paying these tariffs, I think, changes a bit over time, and we're seeing that in some of the data. But yeah, I hear uncertainty all over that story. I hear passing it on to consumers down the line.
Another example is the exact opposite. And I think what the intended effect of the tariffs are. We went to Faribault Mill, which is a 155-plus-year-old wool blanket maker in Faribault. They're the oldest manufacturer in the state of Minnesota. They make all the real wool blankets that every soldier in the U.S. Army gets in their ration and in their pack. They've been doing that since the Civil War. And then they make sort of high-end wool blankets for blanket lovers. And they are completely vertically integrated. Like, all their wool is domestically sourced. Mm-hmm. They hire people in Faribault. They have the same mill. They invest in their company. They import fewer than 1%, like a drop in the bucket of anything. Everything is made locally. They don't have a war room. They don't have anything set up to worry about tariffs. They're not worried about tariffs at all because all of their business has nothing to do with imports. In fact, they're getting new calls and they're getting new business opportunities because domestic companies want a new domestic source of cotton or wool. The only concern that the CEO there had was if people's wallets dry up, and that's a problem for everybody. But that was like sort of what seems like the intended effect of a tariff is to incentivize domestic production and sort of bolster domestic production. Does that seem fair?
Absolutely. And there was some polling from CNBC that asked small businesses about how they thought tariffs were going to affect them. And so roughly 2/3 of small businesses thought tariffs would affect them, but only 51% thought they would affect them negatively. And you are going to get some winners, right? This would be one of those winners. But then there are potential, you say, oh, tariffs aren't going to negatively affect us, but those changing consumer behavior can also be indirect effects from tariffs. And I might add on to that other supplies they might buy might also be subject to inflationary pressures in ways that they aren't foreseen. If their workers, for instance, are experiencing higher inflation elsewhere, they might request or demand more pay in the future. So certainly there are going to be winners there, but maybe the win isn't as big as they initially think if the economy in general slows down.
So here's my big question. Let's go back to the Curio rug, the importer of these Persian rugs, right? 100% of her business is relied on this imported, high luxury, pre-owned rugs that everybody loves, right? And they're expensive, but you can't get them anywhere else. They don't make them in the United States. This is a traditional product that's made from those areas for thousands of years. So if there's a baseline tariff on all of these countries, Afghanistan, Iran, India, Turkey, but we're like, yes, she's going to like maybe move to the country and get more rugs from the country that has the smallest tariff. Okay, so there's that pressure to move towards a better deal. But what does it say about the United States and those countries? Like these rugs are like all some of those towns sell and make. Like that's what they do. What is the point of the tariff in this case? And I guess I don't understand that. When it's applied like a shotgun universally, what is the point? We're not going to start making Persian rugs here, I don't think. We don't have the skill or the business set up or any of it, right?
Right. And I don't think you have to make the argument to me that the shotgun approach isn't the right one. I think there's lots of
I'm just curious. I'm
other
not saying that. I'm just curious why.
Yeah, so I can make that argument. I'm happy to, I'll try and make that argument. I want to make the same argument as you first, like add coffee to that list, right? Something that most Americans wake up and drink every day.
We don't grow it.
Produce in small amounts in Hawaii, but other than that, right, that's going to increase your morning brew, right? And there's no chance that we suddenly start producing coffee in Minnesota or much less other parts of the country. An argument could be made that, we have this trade deficit, that part of what the focus of administration has been is that, well, if there are tariffs on U.S. goods being sold to Afghanistan, then they need to lower their tariffs too, so that there's a smaller trade deficit between those two countries.
And I'm pretty sure they have pretty high tariffs there, but their economy is like 1/1,000,000th of ours.
Yes, and that's the weak point to this argument. So there's been a country was been in the news, Lesotho or Lesotho, that has we have a very high trade deficit with Lesotho. And the reason is kind of what you're pointing out, is their economy is much weaker than ours.
Right.
We want something really important from them, diamonds. They don't really need Goldman Sachs services, or they don't need Boeing airplanes, and hence we're going to have a trade deficit there. The best economic plan is not to get rid of that trade deficit so that we all pay higher amounts for diamond rings and every wedding becomes more expensive. It's that we need to become more competitive in other countries where our products are more valuable.
Is there an argument to be made, though, that the president is exposing perhaps a new economic weapon in tariffs? I know we've always thought of tariffs as like a way to defend your domestic production and defend things you make locally, and even the playing field. Like if China is subsidizing the price of making their steel, it's kind of cheating the system, and we want to make it more fair. We understand that those are the effects of tariffs, or those are the purpose of tariffs. But the president is using them as pure leverage in a number of different ways to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does end up producing better deals and they come down with reverse tariffs, or is that a new idea to use that as a sort of a weapon, sort of a leverage?
There's always been back and forth in these trade deals. And so in that sense, there's been negotiations, but I think the scale is certainly new. And that's best case scenario, right? Maybe 5 years from now, we look back and there have been markets opened up for U.S. producers all over the world, and we say this was amazing deal making. So far, I'm skeptical of that, and a couple of reasons for that. One is that the trade deals that we've seen announced to date have occurred in a matter of weeks, maybe a month,
Mm-hmm.
and traditionally that's not how long trade deals take.
Right.
We've seen outlines of trade deals, and the outlines that we've seen have not dramatically opened up markets abroad for U.S. companies. They've largely scaled back the tariffs that were announced, and then the kind of counter tariffs that were announced by other countries, putting us back at square one. And so I think that starts to undermine this idea that there's going to be big deals made when the deals that are being announced are usually just circling back to where we started. So I would love the idea that we end up with more markets for U.S. products, maybe that we even have lower tariffs for products to come in here, but the baseline seems to be at least a 10% tariff, and often the deals are just circling back to where we started from.
And what happens in the future then? If he's in office for another 3.5 years,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say Congress is still divided or it flips to the Democrats, will it sort of castrate his power in that regard?
Yeah, one of the troubles with this being interpreted as presidential power is that also means that it can go away just as rapidly with a new presidential administration.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not on the small business side, where small businesses can be much more agile when they make decisions about to import something new. But when we talk about car manufacturers opening new plants, those are multi-year investment decisions. And that uncertainty makes it really unappealing to change their policies until they know that there's going to be some certainty about the tariff landscape going forward.
Yeah.
So I'm skeptical about the deal making associated with this, simply because past deals have taken vast amounts of effort and time that we're not seeing put into these deals right now. And every kind of new notification that, we've reached a trade deal, which is merely an outline that isn't officially written down into law, makes me skeptical that it ends up being rock solid for the future.
Okay, so another part of the deal was like, at least what the president said, is that he wants America to make more stuff again.
Mm-hmm.
And like most people, I think we were all saddened in the 80s and 90s when every week you'd hear of a new American company saying, we're closing down this factory and we're outsourcing the work. We're closing down this headquarter and we're outsourcing the work. It happened all over the place. Yeah. But will these tariffs bring that work back? And from an economic standpoint, could there be a better way that Congress or the president could incentivize companies to bring work back to the United States
mm-hmm.
outside of tariffs, which just hurts consumers' wallets, frankly?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a more effective tool than a tariff to bring corporations' work back?
Yeah. So on the first one about kind of what we know with respect to this is that tariffs have had limited effects in bringing jobs back. So if you looked at 2018, the washing machine tariff brought, let's call it a few thousand jobs back to washing machine manufacturers in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Steel tariffs brought back a few thousand jobs, but those were all, we paid a high price for each of those jobs that we brought back. And those were much smaller in scale compared to what we're seeing right now. So it's really hard to say, does that scale up to 15, 20, 30,000 jobs? I think there's so much uncertainty around that. I hesitate to guess.
Yeah.
But bottom line is it'll be expensive. And even if those jobs do come back, I'm more skeptical that it's the jobs and it's maybe manufacturing production comes back. That the factory that left in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s doesn't look the same as the factory that comes back in the 2020s. It'll have more machinery, it'll have more robotics, it'll have more AI. It doesn't need to be the same labor-intensive industry that it was when it left. And so that even if these factories do come back, I think that you can make a really strong argument that what it does instead is increases economic inequality, that the people that have the means to build the factories, the shareholders, are going to be the ones that benefit from these investments, whereas workers still don't get the jobs that they were promised.
America still has the big wallet too. And isn't another side effect that you see, like if we tariff China 100%, don't these companies like Apple just move their processes to India or another country that can still make it cheaply, but just not China?
Yeah, and maybe that is part of what we want to do, right? Maybe we want to move more production to India that has more friendly relations with the United States, is at least on some level a democracy that maybe we share more values with. And that might be a valid national security policy. And the bottom line, though, is even those kind of changes, I'm guessing, I'm not on the Apple board, but that was probably in the works for a long time. And it was announced during the Trump administration because those type of changes are not easy to do. I think we often think about Chinese manufacturing as rudimentary, but China has tons of manufacturing capabilities that we don't have in the United States. A lot of it is highly technical that cannot be easily moved. Just as an example, so I'm a rock climber outside of being an economist. And, one of the things with rock climbing is you want your safety gear to work, right? And so there's this company called Black Diamond that produces carabiners, things that attach you to the rock in case you fall.
Yep.
And they put out an announcement probably a month or two ago that they're going to have to raise prices because they're importing stuff from China. The companies that they've worked with in China, they've worked with over long periods of time. They've made sure that those production processes are safe. They don't want to go through recalls in the future. And every time they start a new factory, if they were to move their production, they're worried about what happens if it's not exactly right. What happens if somebody dies on our safety gear? What does that do to our company? And so those kind of changes in your supply chain are not as easy to do as some people might think, that there's a lot of know-how in China that's hard to replace elsewhere.
What percentage of economists do you think agree with you about these tariffs? Because I've heard it's 99.8%.
I think it's very high. I wouldn't go 99.8. I'd say 95%. But there's still room for nuance, right? That you would find some economists that would say that every tariff is bad. I wouldn't put myself in that category. I think there are types of tariffs that can be used strategically.
Like steel.
Like steel. Maybe not the 50%
From China,
that we have
perhaps.
right now on specific countries. Absolutely. Maybe thinking about some of the softwood lumber imports from Canada, where we found that some Canadian manufacturers were getting a leg up and was unfair competition against U.S. manufacturers. So we talk about Section 232 versus 301 tariffs. Those Section 301 tariffs, where they undergo an investigation into unfair trade practices.
Right.
We use them to try and level the playing field. Tariffs can be used strategically to make sure that U.S. firms have fair competition. You're going to get close to that 99% when you talk about across-the-board tariffs, because it's targeting goods that we don't have any skin in the game, if you will. We're never going to produce dragon fruit in the U.S. We're never going to produce coffee. We're never going to produce those Persian rugs. So why put a tariff on them? All it does is increase prices to consumers and limits consumer choice.
What are you as an economist? Okay, so like if you're an immunologist or a vaccinologist, the pandemic was your bread and butter. That was your field, and people started paying attention and learning about it. This, I feel like, is that for economists, because it puts macroeconomics on this like front page all the time. It makes me interested in it much more because you're seeing the wheels of economics turn in real time. What are we learning in real time? What are you learning in real time?
Macro has kind of gone through this weird post-pandemic into kind of tariff cycle here. And during the post-pandemic period, I think that economists were getting a lot of things wrong. We weren't forecasting well because the world was changing so quickly. And that largely led to economists saying things like, the economy looks pretty good. People weren't feeling it, and economists were largely getting tuned out. I think this time around, the evidence suggests that what economists are saying about tariffs has largely been picked up by consumers. That in survey evidence about what consumer inflation expectations are, every time a Liberation Day event happens, consumers expect prices to go up more a year from now. When those things were postponed, we saw some decreases in inflation expectations. So the message about the effects of tariffs, at least in the big aggregate sense, has largely been borne out by consumers and what they think is going to happen in the world. The other thing that we're learning is that when you have forward-thinking consumers and companies, it's going to take longer for inflation from tariffs to show up. So one of the things that happened is that a bunch of companies knew that they were going to have to pay more for their inventory. And so they bought a bunch of inventory ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And consumers bought a bunch of cars to get ahead of tariffs.
They stocked up.
They stocked up. And because they stocked up, that meant that the stuff they were putting on the shelves, they didn't have to raise the prices right away.
Right.
And even after they burn through that inventory, they might decide to still hold off a little bit because they're worried about consumers and their ability to take on these new price increases. Now, because of that, things that can be documented in the data, the hard data sources about inflation don't necessarily show the effect of tariffs yet. We haven't seen it in consumer price index. We haven't even seen it in the producer price index because of the forward-looking behavior of consumers and firms. And I think it's interesting to think about that agents are like we model them, that they don't look at just what's happening here and now. They're thinking about what's coming down the road.
When do you think it'll show up?
I think we're getting close to that tipping point. Simply the amount of data we see from what we call soft data. So whether that's your spam inbox with your favorite company saying they're going to raise prices, or the small businesses you've talked to, I think they are starting to show up. But later this summer would be when I would expect to see some more of those price increases show up in the data.
Also, the fluctuation of those created that huge roller coaster in the stock market that some said was manipulatable, but there was a lot of calls and puts going out at that certain time. But do you imagine if you're an importer, or like let's say you're just ordering rugs, right? And they're coming from China, let's say, and you just paid 125% duty on it, and then tomorrow it's down to 10 because of it. It's like you just took thousands of dollars of money before you just radically changed it.
And we're talking about a relatively small importer, right? So some of those tax bills can be very high.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in the, I'd argue, like uncomplicated case, right? A lot of these tariffs depend on, for instance, how much of the product is made in certain countries, right? So some of the tariffs from Canada and Mexico right now are really complicated because some of the goods are subject to a free trade agreement. Some of them aren't. Mm-hmm. The ones that aren't, companies used to just pay a tariff on because they were small enough tariffs that they just paid the tariff because it was too hard to document whether it was subject to the free trade agreement. And now, like, you have entire probably divisions at some companies that their entire job is to try and figure out if these things should be subject to the trade agreement. How do we document that? And it's a huge waste of time and resources to kind of have these big upheavals in the trade process.
All right, we're going to wrap up in a second here, but you had a story about your mom.
Yes.
Tell me, what's going on?
Yeah, I was on the phone with my mom yesterday, and she was telling me this story about, my mom and dad both like to order stuff for the kids all the time,
Sure.
my kids. And so somebody knocks at the door, and it's the UPS driver. And usually they just leave the package, but this one, apparently they had to sign for, and he's got this little package in his hands. And he's like, okay, I can't leave it here. I need you to pay the shipping on it before I can leave. And so he hands the package over. It's super light. And my mom's like, okay, well, how much is the shipping? We usually pay shipping ahead of time. And he's like, it's going to be $170. And my mom's like, this is light. How this can't really be $170. But is this a scam? But the UPS truck is there. So, I mean, it'd be a pretty involved scam. He's got the whole uniform and the UPS truck. And the guy's like, I can't leave until you pay this. So she pays the $170 tariff. She doesn't know it's a tariff at the time. She just knows that she has to pay it.
It's a fee. Yeah.
It's a fee. And so my dad comes home and is like, being like, you got scammed. There's no way it's 3 hats and a sweatshirt. There's no way. And so he calls up the company, and the company's like, yeah, because there's this de minimis exemption that usually applies
Under
to small
$800?
packages, now is often being paid by the carriers that bring in the United States. And so that's what happened, is this came from abroad, and the carrier then collects that tariff.
So was it like $90 worth of stuff?
Yeah.
So she had to pay $175?
Yes. It was more than the value of like the
Stuff.
hats that my dad bought for my kids.
So you're from China?
Yeah. I'm assuming it came from China.
Yeah.
I didn't get to see the exact receipt, but like these kind of like events are happening to small businesses. They're happening to consumers. And it just leads to lots of awkward conversations, like the one at the doorstep, and you're like, am I getting scammed? No, it's changes in trade policy that somebody has to pay it. It's either consumers or profit margins for firms.
All right. We're going to talk again in, let's say 3 months or 6 months. What do you anticipate will happen in that time?
In 3 to 6 months, I think we'll have more concrete data that prices are increasing. And I think that's going to be important, because I worry about being the economist that cried wolf, that economists have talked a lot about prices increasing from tariffs. And it's a double-edged sword, right? I don't want prices to go up, but I also want to make sure that when we're giving guidance as a profession, that it's the right guidance. And so that would be my expectation, that prices will be higher 3 to 6 months from now. I think there'll also be broader looks at, are we actually starting to see any kind of jobs coming back in tariff-affected industries? And I think it's largely too soon for those kind of movements, but you'll hear more chatter about that as opposed to just how are prices changing.
All right. Tyler Schipper, Associate Professor, Economics and Data Analytics, University of St. Thomas. Thanks for helping us sort through this, man. I appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.